Hello, I'm Sara Whybrew, and I'm here to talk you through the new apprenticeship reforms in England. I'm going to take you through a bit about creative and cultural skills, the new apprenticeship standards, and the new apprenticeship levy and public sector target associated with the reforms. So let me start by telling you a bit more about creative and cultural skills, who we are and what we do. We are the sector skills body for the creative and cultural industries, but we're also a national charity working right across the UK that believes true economic growth in the creative and cultural sector only happens with access to the right talent and skills. But we believe very strongly that talent should be supported and accessed regardless of someone's background or previous educational achievement. We have three core strands to our work. We have a big strand focusing on apprenticeships and technical education. And we live and breathe apprenticeships from every angle. We employ apprentices, we have delivered apprenticeship training, we support the development of new apprenticeship standards, we are a certificating body for apprenticeship frameworks, and we deliver a lot of information, advice and guidance to employers on best practice apprenticeship recruitment and management. We also have a strand of work dedicated to careers advice and guidance and a large national online resource called Creative Choices. Please do have a look at this if you are working in careers advice and guidance. And we also have our National Skills Academy, which is our industry and education network across the country that works to create opportunities for young people to progress into the sector. So let me give you a bit of background about the government's new apprenticeship reforms. So back in 2012, Doug Richards wrote his review of apprenticeships, and the overarching theme that came out of his review was that employers should be put in the driving seat where apprenticeships were concerned. As part of these reforms, the government has proposed to withdraw all existing apprenticeship frameworks in England only by 2020. Some frameworks have already been switched off and they get withdrawn in batches. The last batch is due to be withdrawn in October 2019, and details of which frameworks are going to be withdrawn when are published on the gov.s site. When frameworks are withdrawn, they're going to be replaced, and already are being, by new employer-led apprenticeship standards. Standards are much simpler than frameworks, concentrating solely on the knowledge, skills and behaviours of a unique occupation. What's great about apprenticeship standards is that employers choose the training that their apprentices get when working to an apprenticeship standard, and I'm going to tell you a bit more about these in a moment. There is an overhaul of the apprenticeship funding system as part of the reforms, which includes the introduction of the new apprenticeship levy, which I'm also going to tell you about. And as part of the government's wider reforms around apprenticeships, they've set a new 3 million target of new apprenticeship starts between 2015 and 2020, which is an increase of 1 million starts from the previous government period. So it's quite ambitious. So why should we care about apprenticeships? Well, Creative and Cultural Skills, as I've already mentioned, believes very strongly in supporting the next generation of talent, and we feel very strongly that apprenticeships create a new entry route for a much more diverse demographic. We want to ensure that there are fairer entry routes into our workforce so that we can access those with the most talent and potential. We are a graduate-heavy sector. We, in fact, employ more graduates than any other employment sector. And so we want to try and redress the balance here and make sure there are a range of routes into the jobs in our industry for anyone who wishes to pursue one. We also want to work hard to change historic recruitment cultures in our sector. We have an endemic culture of unpaid work and unpaid internships. In the vast majority of cases, these contravene national minimum wage legislation, and we want to make sure that employers don't get unstuck here in relation to poor employment practices, but we also want to make sure that these sorts of opportunities don't just go to those who are able to work for free, which obviously has an impact on the diversity of our sector. So we want to try and make sure that by opening up entry routes, particularly through apprenticeships, that we can encourage greater diversity across our sector, as currently it isn't as reflective of the makeup of our society as we would like it to be. I'm going to move over this slide because today we're not going to hear from an employer about their experience of employing apprentices, but we do have many case studies on our website. So what is an apprenticeship? Well, it's quite simple, really. It is just a job with training. Legally, this is what it's defined as. There are 3 core elements to an apprenticeship. On-the-job learning, that's the job that the apprentice is employed and paid to do by the employer. Off-the-job learning, this must represent 20% of an apprenticeship. And the off-the-job learning is delivered by a registered training provider. And off-the-job learning is simply defined as any learning that is in addition to what an apprentice would be doing day to day on the job. And functional skills, which is a mandatory element of all apprenticeships. What this means in simple terms is English and maths. This only applies to an apprentice where they don't hold a suitable qualification in these 2 subjects to the minimum required level, which is identified and outlined in the respective apprenticeship standard that the apprentice would be working to. Usually this is no more than level 3 English and maths. That's the equivalent to what would have been GCSE grade A starter C, or now GCSE grade 6 or 5 to 9. So who's involved in delivering an apprenticeship now? Well, this changed as part of the reforms. There is still obviously an employer involved in delivering an apprenticeship who is legally responsible for giving an apprentice a real job and issuing them with a contract of employment. All apprentices must be contracted and paid for at least a year, but should ideally be contracted for the typical duration outlined in the respective apprenticeship standard they're working to. The employer is now entirely responsible for selecting the training provider who delivers the off-the-job training. The training provider, if delivering apprenticeships, must be on the new register of approved apprenticeship training providers. If the training provider isn't on this register, they cannot deliver apprenticeship training provision. And we urge all employers to check that a training provider is registered before they work with them to deliver an apprenticeship. A training provider is also responsible for helping the apprentice gain their functional skills qualifications, the English and maths I mentioned a moment ago. And new as part of the reforms, an independent endpoint assessment organisation who is selected by the employer as well, is responsible for assessing the apprentice at the end of their apprenticeship. This is new for any employer who has previously taken on an apprentice against an apprenticeship framework. They will be familiar with ongoing assessment or continuous assessment of the apprentice throughout their apprenticeship. That no longer applies when working to an apprenticeship standard. All assessment is undertaken at the end. The endpoint assessment organisation must also be registered to do this job and must be independent of the training provider and employer, but can be known to both. So let me tell you a little bit more about the new apprenticeship standards, how they're developed, and how you, an employer, might want to get involved in supporting the creation of new apprenticeship standards. All apprenticeship standards are developed by a trailblazer group, which is made up of small and large employers. They take, on average, 1 year to develop. Sometimes they can take less time, or sometimes they take longer, but the recommended duration is 1 year. So if an employer does want to get involved in developing a new apprenticeship standard, they do need to know that they need to stick with it for at least a year. And all standards and apprenticeship frameworks, where they still exist, i.e. haven't been withdrawn, are all allocated funding bands. The funding bands are really important to understand as an employer now, as this represents the cost of the off-the-job training and the endpoint assessment, or what the government recommends the off-the-job training should cost, along with the endpoint assessment. If you're a levy payer, then much of this off-the-job training you are paying for directly through your levy vouchers, which I'll talk about in a moment. So if you want to develop a new apprenticeship standard, and there are over 500 apprenticeship standards in development right across the economy at the moment, employers must agree the unique occupation that the apprenticeship standard is to be developed against. This is really important and a fundamental shift from frameworks. The occupation that is addressed and a standard is developed for must be obviously real, and the employers that make up the Trailblazer group must employ people who work in the occupation that the standard focuses on. A Trailblazer group must be made up of a minimum of 10 employers, 2 of which must have less than 50 employees. It's important to note that a Trailblazer group can have more than 10 employers on it, but it does need to be a process that is manageable, and we would encourage that Trailblazer groups don't go wildly above 10 employers to make the process realistic and manageable. The Trailblazer Group is responsible in the first instance for writing the proposal to develop a standard, previously called an expression of interest, and they must work with the Institute for Apprenticeships from the start. We would certainly encourage that, and we can work with Trailblazer Groups to work with the Institute for Apprenticeships, or we can do that work on behalf of a Trailblazer group. You do need to get permission from the Institute for Apprenticeships to submit your proposal to develop a standard, and when you have done that, the Institute will either give you approval to go ahead and develop the standard, or they will reject you. It's really important to work closely with the Institute, and it's also really important to recognise what constitutes a unique occupation, and that's guidance that we can support you with if needed. When you've been given approval by the Institute to develop a standard, you then go ahead and write the core apprenticeship standard for the occupation you're concentrating on. An apprenticeship standard must outline the role profile and identify the core knowledge, skills and behaviours that would apply to that occupation regardless of the setting the role existed in. So it needs to be transferable. The standard really reads like a detailed job description. That's probably the easiest way to think about it. And the standard also outlines the minimum requirements that an apprentice would need to meet before starting that particular apprenticeship, and the level at which the apprenticeship is pitched at. And I'll talk about levels in a moment. When the standard has been accepted by the Institute for Apprenticeships as being ready to submit to them for approval or for consideration, the Trailblazer Group is responsible for putting that standard out to consultation with the wider sector, and what that really means is with other employers who would ordinarily employ people into the occupation. And alongside this, they must develop a costing plan for the delivery of the off-the-job training. That costing plan helps inform which funding band might be issued to the apprenticeship upon approval. When you're given permission to submit the standard, having gone through consultation, the Institute will, you can send it into the Institute, and it will then go to an industry route panel for consideration and will either be approved or rejected. If approved, you can then go ahead and develop the assessment plan to accompany the apprenticeship standard. You can actually develop the assessment plan at the same time as writing the standard. We advise against doing that because there is a risk that you could put a lot of work into developing an assessment plan and find that the standard is rejected. So we advise that you wait until you get some sort of approval from the IFA, the Institute for Apprenticeships, on the standard before developing the assessment plan. And what the assessment plan does is it outlines how the apprentice will be assessed at the end via that independent endpoint assessment organisation. But what's really key here is that it is employers deciding how apprentices will be assessed against those core knowledge, skills and behaviours. So as I said earlier, employers are very much in the driving seat. Once the assessment plan has been approved, having had the standard already approved, the government will issue a funding band to the apprenticeship, and as I said earlier, the funding band is the amount of funding that the government recommends the off-the-job training and endpoint assessment should cost. Endpoint assessment is not allowed to represent more than 20% of the issued funding band. It's important to say that industry bodies such as Creative and Cultural Skills can support trailblazer groups through this process of developing a standard. We do this quite frequently. We do not inform the content of standards. We simply manage the paperwork on behalf of the trailblazer group and liaise with the Institute for Apprenticeships on behalf of the group. So let me take you through apprenticeship levels. Now, for ease of reference, I am using the old GCSE grades. Obviously, the A star to G grades that existed in GCSEs previously have now been replaced with numbers 1 to 9, 9 being the equivalent to an A star. Although we still use the terminology intermediate, advanced and higher level apprenticeships, what you'll see in each apprenticeship standard for the occupation it's been developed against is a level at which that standard is pitched at, and that level represents the level of competency, the level of difficulty that the apprentice is expected to achieve and meet it by the end of their apprenticeship. So to give you an idea, a level 2 apprenticeship is the equivalent level of difficulty, not value, to GCSEs, grade A star to C. So that's 5 to 9 in the new system. An advanced level apprenticeship is or a level 3 apprenticeship is the equivalent level of difficulty to A level. Higher level apprenticeships are anything from level 4 and above, mainly up to level 7. Which is the equivalent, level 7 is the equivalent to postgraduate study. Level 4 is the equivalent level of the first year of a degree. And then degree apprenticeships are different to higher level apprenticeships in that they include either a full bachelor's degree or a full master's degree. Now, they still have to be aligned to an apprenticeship standard via the process I've already outlined. And when developing a degree apprenticeship, there has to be at least 2 universities as part of that trailblazer group developing the standard. However, universities are not allowed to lead the trailblazer group or chair it. They are only allowed to be part of the group. But it's important to say that higher level apprenticeships are pitched at a single higher level, so they're either at level 4, level 5, level 6 or level 7, whereas a degree apprenticeship will either be at level 6, covering levels 4, 5 and 6 if it has a bachelor's degree as part of it, or it will be at level 7 with a master's degree as part of it. The other levels where it's not a degree apprenticeship, the off-the-job training just represents 20% of the apprenticeship, but with the degree apprenticeship, the off-the-job training is made up of actually undertaking the full bachelor's or master's degree that is approved as part of the apprenticeship standard. So here are your 15 funding bands, the funding bands I've mentioned earlier, and the reason it's important to understand these as an employer is so that you can see how much you're contributing to the cost of the off-the-job training and endpoint assessment. Now, it's very unlikely that there will be any apprenticeships approved for delivery in the creative and cultural sector, or certainly our bit of the creative and cultural sector, predominantly the arts, that has a band issued above band 10, £12,000. The higher funding bands tend to be allocated to the sort of degree and master's degree apprenticeships and the higher level apprenticeships. So you can train now to be a solicitor via a higher level apprenticeship, which is at level 7, and that's been issued the £27,000 funding band. But to give you an idea, the customer service apprenticeship has a £4,000 funding band. So they do vary quite significantly. Now, if you're a levy payer, the levy vouchers which you get back, which I'm going to talk about in a moment, they will be paying this funding band. If you're a non-levy payer, then you're making a contribution to this funding band, which I'll come on to in a moment. Just to give you an idea of the standards in development for our sector, or those that are likely to be widely used by our sector, here are some listed. We do have on our website a full apprenticeship map outlining all of the sector specific standards in development or approved for delivery, and those that are likely to be widely used. I've included here customer service. That hasn't been developed by our sector, but is the standard that is most likely to be used for things like front of house roles. It's very applicable to that sort of occupation. Creative venue technician has just been approved for delivery, and live event rigger we're expecting to be well used right across our sector, of course. It's important to say that business administrator can support a number of roles in our sector, and we have seen actually probably the significant majority of apprenticeships right across our industry working to this standard. It's very flexible and transferable. But it's also important to understand that bid and proposal coordinator, if you've got a fundraising role, is well placed to support that sort of occupation in your organisation. Excuse me. But we will keep people updated as new apprenticeship standards are approved for development and delivery. So let me talk about the Apprenticeship Levy. It came into play from April this year, 2017, and it is paid by employers who have an annual pay bill of £3 million or more. The levy represents 0.5% of those payroll costs, and it is only paid on anything above the 3 million. So if you have a £4.5 million pay bill every year, you pay 0.5% on £1.5 million of it. It is taken monthly via your PAYE and is expected to generate £3 billion a year for the post-16 apprenticeship and skills system. Now, skills levies actually aren't a new thing, but they are to this country. We're probably playing a bit of catch-up here. When you pay your monthly levy vouchers, you will get, when you make your monthly levy payment, you will get back 1 month in arrears levy vouchers for you to spend through your Apprenticeship Service account. If you're a levy payer, you will know whether you've been issued with one of these or not yet. You should have been. Those digital vouchers are what you have to spend on the off-the-job training and endpoint assessment, and you have 2 years to spend them from the date at which they go into your Apprenticeship Service account. This is how the Apprenticeship Levy is calculated. So if you're an international company, the levy payment is only paid on your UK pay bill. But your levy vouchers are always calculated based on your England workforce. So what that means is the employees in your company that have an England-based postcode, and HMRC calculate this behind the scenes on a quarterly basis. They last calculated it in July, and they will do it every 3 months thereafter on a rolling basis. So to give you an idea of how this works, if you're paying £1,000 a month through your levy, and 75% of your workforce is based in, of your UK workforce is based in England, then it will be 1,000 times 0.75, giving you £750, and the government will then top this up by 10%, so making your total levy vouchers worth £825 based on this example. If you use up all of your levy vouchers, because you've created so many apprenticeships that you've spent all of your vouchers on lots of apprenticeship training as per the allocated funding bands, and you want to continue to create more apprenticeships, then the government will revert to what's called a co-investment model. This is where you actually pay 10% of the funding band out of your own pocket, not through levy vouchers, and the government will pay 90%. And this is the model that is used for non-levy payers. So more than 98% of all employers fall into the non-levy paying bracket. So that 3 billion that I mentioned earlier will be generated by 2% of employers across the country. So it is really quite unusual that there's such disparity here. But and just to give you an idea, that 73% of apprentices created prior to the levy system will have been employed by what would now be classed as non-levy paying employers. So if you are a non-levy payer, obviously there's no levy payment taken monthly via your PAYE. But if you want to create apprenticeships, there is now a mandatory 10% contribution that you have to make towards the training costs, and you pay that 10% contribution out of your own pocket, in addition to paying the apprentices' wages. Now, you can get an additional £1,000 for taking on an apprentice aged 16 to 18 or 19 to 24 who is a care leaver. There is an emphasis on trying to create apprenticeships for this or these demographics. And those with less than 50 employees, so employers with less than 50 employees who do employ from this demographic, they won't be required to make a 10% contribution at all. The government will fully fund the off-the-job training and endpoint assessment as per the funding band allocated. You are expected as non-levy payers to have access to the Apprenticeship Service from 2018. That's the digital online account that I mentioned earlier that levy payers have. That digital apprenticeship service account is how employers, or levy paying employers at the moment, select their training provider and enter into an apprenticeship agreement with a training provider. And it's also where they select the endpoint assessment organisation. That digital account for levy payers automatically makes a monthly payment to the training provider from their pot of levy vouchers. At the moment, if you're a non-levy payer, you work directly with the training provider to agree how you pay your 10% contribution. What most colleges are doing and training providers are doing is taking that 10% contribution on a monthly basis over the duration of the apprenticeship. From 2018, levy payers will be permitted, as things currently stand, to transfer up to 10% of their levy vouchers to those in their supply chain. That means other employees in their group or in a wider network. But at the moment, there are no plans for levy payers to be able to transfer any more of those vouchers. But what it will mean is some non-levy payers will have access to some vouchers to spend on apprenticeship training. So this is my only official government slide. I won't go through this in detail, but what it does do is take you through the steps that you would go through when taking on an apprentice. So if you're a non-levy payer, you would go through steps 1 to 3 before starting your apprentice. If you're a levy payer, you would go through steps 1 to 5. So I'll pause there a moment for you to have a look through this slide. If you're not sure about any of these stages, then creative and cultural skills can help you with each of these stages if needed. So let me talk about the public sector target, which is also a feature of the government's new apprenticeship reforms. So public bodies are defined by the Office for National Statistics. They have a very clear definition of what a public body is. I suspect if you are one, you know about it. The apprenticeship public sector target applies to every public body that has 250 employees or more at the 31st of March each year for the year ahead. The public sector target requires public bodies who have this many employees to ensure that 2.3% of their workforce is made up of new apprenticeship starts each year. And it's important to say that at the moment this public sector target applies between 2017 and 2021. So over the next 4 years, it does apply to new apprenticeship starts only. So if employers already have apprentices on programme, they can't count those from the previous year. It has to be new starts in the year that you're going to, in effect, report against. But it is also important to say that the 2.3% target can be averaged across that 4-year period. So it could be that only 1% of your workforce is made up of new apprenticeship starts in 1 year, but then you significantly increase the percentage in the next year to ensure that over the 4-year period, 2.3% of your workforce is made up of new apprenticeship starts. Now, many public bodies are only really going to be able to achieve this target if they look at supporting existing staff to undertake apprenticeships. Now, apprenticeships are a great way to help people upskill as well as support new entrants into a workforce. And because we've got many more high-level and degree apprenticeships, as mentioned earlier, public bodies should be thinking about, and any employer should be thinking about how apprenticeships can also be used to support and develop existing members of staff as well as new entrants. All public sector bodies who are subject to this target will be required to report to government within 6 months of the respective target year end, and they are going to be asked to make all their apprenticeship data public so that it's clear how public bodies are performing against this target. Now, it's very hard for creative and cultural skills to talk about apprenticeships without talking a bit about a best practice approach to apprenticeships. These are the steps that we encourage employers to go through when planning for new apprenticeship opportunities. We always encourage employers to start with a real job and a job description. The job description itself will help determine the difficulty and level of the apprenticeship and therefore the type of candidate that you might be looking to reach out to. But the job description will also help determine the most appropriate apprenticeship standard that your apprentice will need to work to. We never ever encourage an employer to work the other way around and start with an apprenticeship standard and shape a job around that. That often, we've seen people do this, and it often means that the apprentice ends up not really doing a job that an employer needs them to do, and that's not appropriate. We obviously encourage employers to understand the costs of taking on an apprentice, particularly if they're a new entrant, as per the numbers that I've outlined already. If you're a levy payer or non-levy payer, you are obviously obligated to pay the apprentice the appropriate minimum wage rate. There is an apprenticeship minimum wage rate which can be paid to any apprentice in the first year of their apprenticeship, regardless of age, or to any apprentice age 16 to 19 if they do an apprenticeship for more than 1 year. When an apprentice turns 19, or if they start their apprentice at 19 or over and go into the second year of an apprenticeship, then the employer is required to then start paying that apprentice national minimum wage for their age, which of course includes living wage if you're over 25 or over. So it's really important that you understand the wage cost that you have to budget for the duration, and you as the employer are responsible for contracting the apprentice for the duration needed in order for them to become competent in the occupation you've employed them into. As I said earlier, although the legal minimum duration that you can employ apprentices for in England is 12 months, you're encouraged to actually contract the apprentice now for the recommended duration outlined in the respective apprenticeship standard. In some cases, this could be several years. Obviously, if you're a non-levy payer, you're also now having to fund the additional 10% contribution towards the training costs in addition to the wage costs. Obviously, you need to identify a training provider, as I said earlier. the training provider must be on the register of approved apprenticeship training providers in order for you to work with them here. If you're not sure about which training providers can support the apprenticeship standard that you think you've identified for the job, then you can contact us and we can help find you a training provider. If you're also not sure which apprenticeship standard is suitable for the job that you've written or that you have, we can also review job descriptions and align them to the most suitable apprenticeship standard. But it's important to say there are some jobs and occupations which aren't supported by an apprenticeship standard yet. When working with the training provider, you, the employer, do have a say over what sort of training your apprentice gets. Where apprenticeship frameworks have been delivered, qualifications were delivered as part of the off-the-job training. That no longer applies, so all apprenticeship standards just have off-the-job training, which should be occupationally relevant and align to the knowledge, skills and behaviours outlined in the apprenticeship standard. It's really important that a training provider, that you as an employer understands that a training provider can't just deliver an existing qualification as part of the off-the-job training unless you want it as the employer. There are some instances where qualifications do feature in the off-the-job training. That's when it has been identified as a license to practice for the occupation. So to give you an example, if someone's doing an electrical apprenticeship, you'd want that apprentice to gain their basic electrical certificate at least. That's a qualification. Qualifications are also permitted if not having a recognised qualification would significantly disadvantage the apprentice when looking for future work. And of course, if it's a registered and approved degree apprenticeship, then the degree itself, which is what makes up the off-the-job training in this instance, is also a qualification. But they're the only instances when a qualification would feature in the off-the-job training delivered by the training provider. So it's really important that you work closely with the training provider to talk about the training you want your apprentices to get. Obviously, when you start recruiting for your apprentice, we really encourage employers to be open and fair here. Please don't just give the opportunity to your neighbour's son or someone you know. We really want you to make sure this opportunity is open to anyone with talent and potential, as we've mentioned earlier. We can't encourage growth in our sector, we can't encourage new entry, we can't encourage diversity if employers aren't open and fair in their recruitment. Really important that if you're employing new entrants into the workforce, so those who may have limited or no experience of the workplace prior to this apprenticeship, then we really do encourage you to plan ahead. It's very easy, particularly with new young workers, to forget that the small things feel like very big things. We've certainly seen cases where employers have forgotten that they don't necessarily need to ask when they perhaps need to go to the bathroom. They might not know where they need to go for lunch, and if they do need to use the telephone as part of their work, remember this is quite a scary thing, so you might want to support them when they first do this. And we have had some instances where an apprentice's dress code has not been appropriate. These are all things that are easily resolved, but please don't forget that they're really important, and it's your job as the employer and the line manager to help the apprentice understand what's appropriate and the do's and don'ts of the workplace. And obviously throughout the apprenticeship, we do encourage that the apprentice is properly supported, that they do have a dedicated line manager, and if they are a new entrant to the workforce, we often suggest that they have a workplace mentor or buddy as well as a line manager, so someone that they can sort of ask those day-to-day questions of, where the relationship isn't quite as formal as it would be with a line manager. It's also important that the manager and the training provider gives the apprentice regular feedback about the things that they're doing really well, but also things they might want to work on. It's not formal assessment as it would have been when frameworks were delivered, but it is a form of assessment around their performance, and it's really important that they get feedback throughout. And the last point that we want to really stress at Creative and Cultural Skills is that whilst there's no obligation for an employer to employ an apprentice at the end of their apprenticeship. The government is now looking to employers to really create apprenticeships with longer term employment in mind. As I said, you're not obligated to take an apprentice on at the end of their apprenticeship, and if you can't do this, if you can't take them on at the end, or you have no plan to, please manage that expectation early on and throughout the apprenticeship. We have had cases where apprentices have been told the week before their apprenticeship finishes that they won't be continuing in their employment, and that's simply unacceptable. Where you can't keep an apprentice on after their apprenticeship, we would encourage you to work with them to look for work, and so that you can support their progression following their time with you. And that's it from me. If you do want further support and guidance from Creative and Cultural Skills, we have a number of resources on our website, ccskills.org.uk. We have a best practice guide to apprenticeships, internships and volunteering, so you can understand the difference between those three types of roles and the associated legalities. We have a whole range of information on trailblazers, and as I said earlier, we have a map on the trailblazers in development and approved delivery for the wider creative and cultural industries. We have a new guide for managers of apprentices that will be ready soon. We have frequently asked questions and a number of resources and tools that we hope you will find helpful when creating apprenticeships for the first time. If you do want to ask us a question, please get in touch at apprenticeshipinquiries@ccskills.org.uk.